Well, thank you so much for this very well-rounded presentation on both the conceptual and the paradigmatic methodological aspects. We'll take questions now. Yes. Let's try and get you.
Thank you for this great presentation. I just have one question, maybe particularly for you. You went through a history of terrorism and probabilities and actual events and real, not real, and so on and so on. How would you comment on what's happening in Europe with the returning jihadis recently? I mean, how should they look at it? Because the situation there, at least in the last 2 years, is quite different, seems to be, and not sure what it means for tomorrow.
Yeah, the issue basically, all our data are always based on historical statistics, and of course at one time Al-Qaeda was going to take over the world and so forth, and it never happened. So what you have to demonstrate if you're worried about ISIS is whether it actually is a change. Obviously numbers are based on what, long period of history in which there's been a lot of terrorism. There's just a lot of very terrible terrorism that have taken place. And so now what we've got is the issue of ISIS, and is that really a game changer? If these sorts of things continue, it would be, essentially. You'd have enough happening, and we'll have to see whether that actually happens. There has been no major attack in Europe for 10 years, from 2005 to 2015, and then you had the Paris attack. The first Paris attack on the Charlie Hebdo thing was obviously much smaller. And basically to see if this is just a smallish group that is going to be policed effectively. What does seem to be coming out of it is that the threat is highly focused on Europe, and that there's problems with coordinating the police. There's not that that's unknown in the United States. So we'll have to see what happens. Generally speaking, if you talk about ISIS just generally, I'm not terribly impressed. Over the last year or so, they lost 40% of their territory. They don't show much military prowess. When they took over Mosul, they were not planning to take over Mosul, according to a report in Reuters. Instead, what they're just planning to take over part of the city, and then probably try to free some prisoners of theirs. And what happened was, as soon as they arrived, the Iraqi army, which was trained by me, by my money, my tax money and yours, basically defected and fled, and leaving the city and its weaponry behind to them. So they then were adept at taking over the city, but that was not their goal. The reason the outcome was there is not because they were so effective, but because their opponent was so pathetic. And so it makes an effort to try, there's been efforts obviously to shore that up. Mostly they're pretty much stagnated. And also, it does seem to be the interest in them about people going overseas to fight, for example, is in decline. That's certainly anecdotal evidence of that, and probably harder-nosed evidence as well. So I'm generally optimistic. It's a tough group to get, and clearly it's pretty horrible if you happen to living where they are. The guy who basically engineered the Paris attack had tried 5 times, basically, and those are all basically failures before doing the Paris attack. So it's not as if they know how to do it every single time. And of course, the attack on the stadium was a complete fiasco. Nothing happened, basically. One person, I think, was killed. So they do seem to be somewhat bumbling as well, though I don't want to downplay the horror of what has happened. It should also be kept in mind that those numbers are still very small. I mean, in Belgium, for example, a friend of mine was just writing 3 people die every year from automobile accidents, which means far more people, Belgians have died since the Belgian attack on automobile accidents than what were destroyed by terrorists. So you'd have to have, essentially, to really change the conditions, you'd have to have a huge number of Parises or San Bernardinos or Belgians, Brussels. If that does happen, then you want to go back and recalculate. That would be a real change. But I'm fairly optimistic that that's not going to happen. Both I and also Peter Bergen talks about it in his book about whether the United States is likely to be vulnerable, and that seems to be very questionable. It's hard to get here. The fact that it's so easy to get to Europe and that the number of attacks has been so small is impressive. It suggests that even if we were less good at keeping them out, they would not necessarily do that much damage. The effect in the United States, however, seems to be, so far, has been entirely atmospheric, inspirational. And there's no way you can quash an inspiration. I mean, if ISIS is totally destroyed in Europe, in the Middle East, it could still inspire people. People are still inspired by Osama bin Laden. He's been dead for 6 years. People have been inspired by, Che Guevara, and he's been dead for 50 or something. So inspiration is something that comes out of that. And so all the attacks, I think, in the United States, of which there's this large number I gave you from 2015 and so forth, people have been picked up. And except for the one in San Bernardino, they've been, extremely, very little damage, whatever. They were frequently they were frequently captured because they were advertising their perspective on Facebook and on Twitter and so forth. And the average one was like the guy I talked about in Rochester, and basically sort of out of it. Also, if you only have lone wolves, generally do not do very much damage because you really need, like the Paris thing, a bunch of people to really do a whole lot of damage. Generally speaking, lone wolves have killed very few people. It's, Max Abrams has calculated, this is before San Bernardino, but of the 3,000 biggest terrorist attacks in history, only a handful were carried out by lone wolves. You can have it someplace like Breivik is sort of scary, and that's because that was a really lone wolf attack. He wasn't a Muslim, of course, he's an anti-Muslim, but in Norway. So the issue basically, the short answer is basically, if this really continues, it might be a game changer. But I think it has to be a lot of it to really change the basic situation.
I was just wondering, you guys were talking about how you would go to conferences and you'd be the only two that would actually have numbers of like risk analysis. And what is it about terrorism that makes people throw these numbers out the window and just kind of spend all this money and apparently like unreasonably,
Yeah, I mean it's quite dismaying that you go to these conferences and when you see these numbers, they're surprised. I mean, well, they act surprised at least.
They really are.
Yeah.
That's worse.
Yeah, I mean they say, wow, that's really fascinating. And I told them it only took me about 2 days. It wasn't like it wasn't like I had to do 5 years of work. It was just 2 days of work. Because there's so few deaths. I spend more time trying to figure out what the population changes have been in different countries. But and then they seem to say, oh, that's really interesting. I should share this with my colleagues. So, which is a good thing too, I suppose. We tend not to hear from them again, but at least that happens. The reasons that are sort of given is that this is a very different sort of a threat. You really can't treat this like a risk from cyclones or a risk from flooding or something. But I would argue that these are low probability, high consequence events, right? And we can model nuclear reactor safety, even though there might be accidents, not much data, but we can still have these predictive models and think about what might happen in the future and what could change. What the hazard can be, what the vulnerability can be, and what the losses can be. So there's a large amount of research of low probability, high consequence events. But the general perception is that, this is somehow different because you're dealing with people. But when you look at nuclear safety, one of the main reasons of accidents is human error. And there's a large amount of research that looks at human factors, human error, how that affects how they respond to incidents and so on. And just like, I think as John said, we're just told, you can't do the benefit because, or because there's been no tax, therefore everything's working. But for example, Australia spends about a quarter less than the Americans do per GDP or per capita, and we've had very few tax. So there's nothing that says why you have to spend 4 times as much money to end up with the same result. The British probably spend about a half per GDP or per capita, and you'd argue that they probably have a much higher threat with the IRA historically and also more so recently. So that's what I find hard to understand, is why the US seems to be so excessive in its spending, much more so than other developed countries. And it's not like the US is seeing any benefit of that compared to other countries. The political imperative is obviously really important, because no one wants to be soft on terrorism. But the spending doesn't have to match the rhetoric. We had a Conservative Prime Minister, John Howard, right after 9/11. He was labelled by George Bush as the man of steel, so he really quite liked that moniker on him. But he talked really tough, and everyone knew where he stood, and we were in Afghanistan, we were in Iraq, but we just didn't spend that much compared to here, and the Canadians and the British are the same. So just something seems to be sort of out of kilter here. And John probably knows why.
I don't know why, but I'll talk about it now. Yeah, the last chapter of the book, we talk about responsible counterterrorism policy. And our argument is basically this is the way you should do it. I have twice talked to sort of major figures in the aviation security area and said the following. The only way to make airplanes completely safe and have zero deaths is, of course, to close down the airline industry. Now, I assume you don't want to do that. So the question is, how much do you really want to spend? How much you're willing to spend to keep the risk low? And the result is that the question is, if the chance of being killed when you get on an airplane is about 1 in a million, is that safe enough? If it's 5 million, is that safe enough? Is it 1 in 100 million safe enough? And they've never basically asked that question, never really responded to it. So I think there's just a major disconnect on that issue.
Oh, sorry. This works, yeah. So I really am excited about this book and your guys' work. I was picturing I wanted to take your talk and give it to my students at Iona College just north of the city, small Catholic college. And they would murmur to each other afterwards that I hate America. And I'll give you a quick anecdote that you'll really appreciate. About 6 or 7 years ago, I had a class of about 20 students, and I was talking about the exaggeration of the terrorist threat. And a student said, well, there could be deaths in the United States from terrorism that we don't know about. And I said, what? And they said, well, there might be a reason why the government wouldn't tell us. There might be some strategic reason. They didn't use that phrase, but that's what they meant. And I was sort of dumbfounded for a few seconds because I thought, this is really crazy. So I pushed at it and I said, wait, no, that doesn't really make sense. Something one of you said, that the government proudly announces when they foil plots, right? That's more the incentive. And it really appeared as if the entire room of 20 or so students agreed with this notion that we could have had deaths in the United States that we don't know about because of security measures, right? And I think it's a great example of the power of ideology, which is what I think you're talking about, right? The idea that all of these people who have your skills are avoiding a key question. In effect, you're whistleblowers, right? You're saying, we're going to use our skills to ask some questions that don't get asked that would threaten jobs, would threaten American geopolitics, and so on. So anyway, I applaud you for that. And I guess my only question is, or thought is, it would be wonderful to connect that, right? To say, in other words, if we sit around and say it's ironic that these conferences, engineering conferences, don't ask these questions, these risk assessment conferences don't ask these questions, I think we're missing the story. It's not ironic. Again, jobs and politics and American foreign policy are based on this insanity, right? And you mentioned the anti-communism thing, right? After World War II, as we all know, a country that was, very destroyed, the Soviet Union in World War II, and had a GNP half of ours, and so on, was going to take over the world, and right. So threat exaggeration, threat inflation is the term, right? Is just so much a part of this, and it's fascinating to hear your account because it becomes an innocent process of nobody just
does the numbers, or they have a reason why terrorism is different. As you pointed out, terrorism can never be eradicated. Anyway, so I don't really have a question. I just wanted to say I appreciate the work.
Well, I am an outsider, so I might not be fully, I might be slightly biased. I mean, one thing that's always occurred to me, as John said, there's so many government agencies who are meant to be dealing with counterterrorism, and each agency is going to protect its own budget. So, for example, the Federal Air Marshal Service, it's a service, right? It's actually a fully independent agency with its own hierarchy. They have training centres and gymnasiums and everything else. It's so therefore, if you want to cut back the numbers, you're cutting back someone's budget and career paths. In Australia, we're a much smaller country, so we don't have the resources of the US. So most of we have fewer agencies, but they do multiple tasks. So and a nice example is the Air Marshals in Australia. That was just a duty given to the government to the Australian Federal Police, which is a bit like the FBI. Right? They're our national police. Well, we only have 7 police forces in the whole country. Each state has 1 police force, and then there's one for all of Australia. Right? So we don't have the 20 or 30,000 you do here. So it was very easy to set up an air marshal service in Australia. Police the police could actually volunteer to serve on it. They were on a rotation, so they got training. They might do for 6 months, and then they'd be rotated off and go back to doing other stuff. So no one's career dependent on having an air marshal service, right? And most police would rather be investigating fraud or white collar crime or cyber stuff than sitting on a plane all day, where you can't drink, you can't sleep, and you can't watch the movies. So it's not much fun. So then when the Australian government decided that, or the Federal Police actually decided, maybe we don't need as many air marshals at any one point in time. It was just an easy redeployment of resources. And I think that works really well, is we can just redeploy resources internally without having to get government approval or someone's agency is worried about getting their funding cut. I mean, there's still internal disputes, obviously, within any agency, but they can redeploy resources. And that may be one of the issues in the US, that there's just too many agencies and no one wants to give up any of their resources.
Yeah, let me get a little bit melodramatic about this issue, because it's really an important one, I think, and it's covered in the last chapter of the book. Just to begin with an anecdote, going further on what Mark was just saying. In all our research, the biggest no-brainer is the Federal Air Marshals. I mean, it's just incredibly costly, bizarrely costly. I mean, how can it cost $1 billion just to sort of arrange for people to fly in free seats around the country? And the risk reduction is obviously almost certainly extremely small, so it fails the cost-benefit analysis. Recently, Congressman Duncan from Tennessee has actually taken up the cudgel on this. First time any politician basically has said sort of what we've been saying. In fact, he quoted us. He got it a bit wrong, but that's right. And he said he wanted to get rid of the Federal Air Marshal system. So when Mark and I were in Washington last fall, we wheedled away to get an invitation to his office, and I talked to one of his top aides. And he says Duncan has not been able to get a single person to sign, single member of Congress to sign into his bill to get rid of the Federal Air Marshals, because they're afraid, like Mark was saying, that something will go wrong and I'll get blamed and so forth. So this ridiculously foolish expenditure, which is causing both the airlines and the taxpayer hundreds of millions of dollars per year, is just going to keep continuing on. The more melodramatic part is this. Essentially, when you really step back from this, the point of government is public safety. The first words in the Constitution practically are preserve domestic tranquility. You don't have to read very far into Thomas Hobbes to see a lot of support for that proposition. The foundation, one of the main foundational reasons, maybe the foundational reasons for having government at all, is for public safety. People want to be safe. They want their children to be safe going to and from school, whatever. And so in society, if you don't have safety, society has a great deal of difficulty functioning. that uncertainty. You want to just be confident, you know, you're not going to be knocked over the head walking down the street. So it's not a trivial issue. It's not simply a bridge to nowhere. It's not spending a little bit too much or too little money on healthcare or whatever in that. It's really the important essence of life. So consequently, people who are in charge of public safety should be extremely responsible about this. They should be using their, and since they don't have infinite amount of money, they have to use it wisely, and they simply are not doing so, particularly in this area. They are very conscious of public emotions, and that should certainly be taken into account. But as risk analyst and legal expert Kaz Sunstein has put it, they should pay attention to what the public says, but they shouldn't necessarily base policy on the public's mistakes. And when they say that I have to do this, otherwise I'll lose my job, I find I have a great deal of difficulty coming up with much sympathy for that position, because my answer is, then why did you take the bloody job in the first place? If somebody goes into the Army and then says, wait a minute, I didn't know I was going to be shot at, I don't want this job, they say, well, you shouldn't have joined the Army. A firefighter refuses to go into a burning building and said, I just joined the fire department to catch up on my sleep. That's not, you shouldn't have taken the job in the first place. If you want to have a job where you're not shot at, or where you don't have to make decisions that might be career threatening, there's lots of opportunities. You can become a plumber. You can become a college professor. I mean, the field is wide open with basically low risk occupations. So if you're taking a job in which, in order to carry out the job, and the job is an extremely important one, the key one in government, public safety, and you're unwilling to you make bad decisions purely because that'll help you keep your job, that's obviously very irresponsible, reprehensible, and ultimately dereliction of duty. If you're not willing to do that any more than the firefighter or the combat soldier, you shouldn't have taken the job in the first place. You didn't have to get the job. So it seems to me that the people who say that, and they say it repeatedly, I can't do this because I'll lose my job. Tough. Then you shouldn't have taken the job in the first place. You knew this might be the case.
So, it seems like you have brilliantly, both of you, shown the incredible waste and irrational kind of decisions. I would add this question of sort of why the fear, I think, needs to be examined and unpacked a little bit. One is, I think, that you didn't mention, so surprisingly, that the infrastructure, your point about the double the per capita spending, per GDP spending, the infrastructure itself generates fear. Constant talk of terrorism, if you see something, I mean, I think we should begin to recognize that all the talk, which is then fed into the echo chamber and then endlessly repeated in Fox News, so it becomes both, it generates the fear, the vast structure we've created to deal with the danger itself is counterproductive in generating its own kind of fear. I think there's something about, and this is particularly interesting, a project I'm working on, there's something about the nature of terrorism that generates special dread. Maybe it's the attack on targeting civilians. There's something psychologically about that fear that's worth taking account of to recognize how, as John pointed out, how it connects. It's like the fear of communism in that sense. Sort of there are no communists by 1972 to speak of, and yet it's still 35% the fear. So that there is something at that. It also connects with the tradition of paranoia, the sort of paranoid tradition in America, which is long-standing. Nevertheless, we do live, all the examples you give of waste is total. I'm glad to hear that the FBI passes the risk analysis test, since so many students, many in this room, and many who have gone through the program have gone into the FBI, and many want to. So for all of the students,
the least work.
For the least work is becoming a college professor, right? But the question that I want to ask you about, where I think there is a real conceptual issue, and that is, we live in the nuclear age. We live in an age of ultimate threats. We live in an age where it's not, God doesn't have to destroy the world. That is in human hands. And I think the connection that one can think about is how that gets linked with global warming. Article yesterday in the New York Times that the oceans may be 25 feet higher by the end of the century. Bangladesh lies maybe 5 feet above sea level. Bangladesh is a country of 60 million people with 2 neighbors that are nuclear tipped. In other words, the kind of dangers I mean, most of your data is about America and terrorism, but terrorism you have to consider it in a global context. And in a global context, the kind of threats, now that I don't know what the answers are, and certainly you give examples of terrible waste, but I don't think one can dismiss, even though there's a context of irrationality and confusion and really stupidity, nevertheless there is this real apocalyptic sort of threat of nuclear danger that's intimately linked to what could become a real chaos on the subcontinent and elsewhere around the world. So that somehow that has to be considered in evaluating these dangers that we face. It puts it in a whole new realm from, if you do cost analysis versus, airplane travel or automobile accidents, et cetera, something is very different in talking about the kinds of potential for dangers in the nuclear age.
Okay, let me broaden that a little bit. It just sort of, one of the things, it's interesting from my standpoint as a political scientist. I had not really worked in sort of comparative risk before I got into this whole game after 9/11, essentially. And what's very bizarre is why people are afraid of some things and not others. For example, you mentioned global warming. There are a lot of people trying to sell the fear of global warming, including the New York Times on the front page yesterday, and it's not selling. There are people trying to sell fear of genetically modified food, and it isn't selling very well. It sells pretty well in France and in Europe, and in Germany, but not here. So it's very, and people are probably much more afraid of radiation than is justified. And they're certainly much more afraid of terrorism than is justified. At the same time, they're not afraid basically of driving cars. And if you really want to save a lot of lives, I'll now propose a law that if it passed and enforced would save 30,000 lives in a year, quite possibly the life of somebody in this room. It's so common. And that is the speed limit for private passenger automobiles shall hereby be 13 miles an hour. That with virtual certainty save 30,000 lives. So if you're not willing to accept that, it means you're willing to pay 30,000 lives in order to be able to get around faster and your Austin Healey or whatever. So it is not the case, however, that people don't pay attention to road safety. They're always saying drive carefully and so forth. And also huge amounts of money have been spent on improving roads and improving automobiles with great success, because your chance of being killed in an automobile accident per mile have gone way down. But nonetheless, the better you make the roads, the better you make the cars, the more people drive. So the result is the total number of people being killed still remains high. And your chance of being killed by a terrorist is like 1 in 4 million or 1 in 80 million, depending on the time frame. Your chance of being killed in an automobile accident is about 1 in 8,000 per year. Fantastically high. It's not quite as high as cancer, but it's way up there. So there's an area where people do spend a lot of money, but no one suggests what I just suggested. That was the terminal solution to that. You still have Uber going fast and cabs going faster, and trains and buses and stuff, so people would still get where they go. But this whole idea, I think you'll agree, is totally bizarre and radical that I just proposed, and inconceivable. Even though everybody knows how horrendous the cost, and they know it in the sense of, routinely saying safe travels, be careful and don't do anything foolish on the road. They know how dangerous it is, but the ultimate way to solve that is to stop it completely, and no one has even proposed it. So what I just said is it comes off as totally bizarre, and it should be totally routine. It seems to me, but it is a case from the beginning that there's these strange. There's a study of people in Romania and in Bulgaria, countries right next to each other, and they ask them about, do you fear this, do you fear that, and so forth, and they're substantially different between the two countries. And so explaining why people are afraid of some things is certainly not objective. But our main point is that it should be objective for policymakers. That is to say, if you spend $1 billion trying to save one life from terrorism, and you could save 1,000 lives by spending it on smoke detectors or something like that, that's really, you've been, like Mark said, you basically caused, no one knows who the people you've saved and who the people you've killed are, but it has the effect of actually killing a lot of people.
Yeah, the comment about global warming is a good one, because actually it's a big issue in Australia. It's probably the biggest political issue, much more than terrorism. And so I've actually done a lot of work on climate change and more about climate adaptation. How can we design infrastructure so it can resist storms and floods and sea level rise? And it's all done in a way that's going to be past a cost-benefit analysis. And basically the same approach as what we're doing here. The same questions: how much does it cost? What's the risk reduction? What's the likelihood? And there's a lot of worst case thinking. Like I also read that Times article yesterday, and the key word says may cause 100-foot rise or something. May is, it could happen, but it's probably it's very, very unlikely. And so again. Yeah, yeah. I mean, the predictions in Australia is 80 centimetres, so about 2.5 foot. And it has been for the last 15 years now, and that's what government policy is based upon. And that's based upon government on modelling by the CSIRO and academics. So it goes up and down a bit, but it's going to be about 2 to 3 foot by 2100. Now, there can be regional areas, but it's not going to go up by 25 foot. That's just not going to happen. It can happen, but when you read the fine print about these reports, for global warming, they assume business as usual. So they basically assume that CO2 emissions will keep on rising, and they're going to increase threefold from what they are now, and there'll be no mitigation. Now, that's an option. That could happen, but the view could be, well, actually, maybe we can reduce emissions, and maybe we can do it quickly, maybe slowly. But to just assume that the business as usual will go on for another 100 years is extraordinarily pessimistic. And another thing that's interesting in the global warming community, at least in Australia, and this security community, is that there's a belief system. You talk to people in the security area, professionals, and they believe that terrorism is the worst possible thing that can happen. No expense should be spared to stop this. Right? And any evidence that they see opposite that just can't be right. And that's the same in some global warming communities. I go to a lot of climate change adaptation conferences back home in Australia, and the last one I went to, there was a panel discussion about, and the question was, is cost-benefit analysis appropriate for climate change? That was the question. And there were 3 speakers against, only 1 speaker for. So the fact that they're even questioning why that a cost-benefit analysis is something that may not be appropriate when we're talking about government spending trillions, or more than that, tens of trillions of dollars, is quite staggering. That they're actually not. What's wrong with looking at costs and benefits, just like we're doing? I mean, you may not like the answers, but it's almost any decision you make in life, you look at the costs and the benefits, and try and weigh them up. So there's a lot of similarities, I think, in terms of fear and overreaction.
I have 2 questions. When you compare the 2 analyses and the 2 PowerPoints, in one you get a full idea that the government, by using the public safety card, they are not only over-generating this fear, they are increasing the public perception of the actual threat and so on and so forth, which I agree. And then when you see the second PowerPoint presentation and you see the amount of money that is being thrown in creating this security, this illusion, is staggering. So what is the answer behind this? Is it a conspiracy? Is it the government throwing all this money to maintain this, to fuel this machinery of profit that is going into different sources, being that the private sector, being that individuals, and so on and so forth? So what is the answer based on the analysis that you have achieved so far? And second, when you are measuring the cost benefit, what exactly are you using? Are you using just the economic damage? Because based on a couple of slides that you were showing, when you calculate that in order for the amount spent in this and that organization, we will need to have 6.7 Paris attacks in order to justify the amount thrown, or 0.7 occasions of Brussels, I believe it was, I can remember now. London. So what exactly are you using in that cost-benefit analysis? Is it just economically based, the damage done in the infrastructure, in that aspect, or how are you calculating the life cost? How are you calculating the social impact that is having, and so on?
Okay. I'll do the same question because that's easier. Yeah, I mean, what we do for to look at the costs, it's more than damage costs. It's the loss of life, it's the social cost, it's the disruption. So when we look at, and we pick very high numbers, we pick what we think is a very large estimate. So if you look at the London attack, where I think 52 people were killed, the Department of Homeland Security actually has a study that says you should value life at $7.5 million per life. Right? And many countries around the world have numbers between $2 and $10 million. So that's a value that you would put on a life. Now you may think that's immoral and not right, but we do that all the time when we determine life insurance, when we determine how is it worth providing tornado shelters for community? Is it worth providing flood protection for community? In Australia, we have the subsidised pharmaceuticals, so there's a cost-benefit analysis to work out if the government is going to subsidise some new drug that's come out that costs a lot of money, how many lives do we think it's going to save? So you may feel uncomfortable about doing those analyses, but it's fact of life. So for London, you take 52 people times 7.5 million. That's about $500 million. Right? The damaged infrastructure is actually quite modest. I mean, some trains were damaged and everything else, and that was only about $100 million in terms of direct physical damage. Not much at all. People got back to work pretty quickly, so there wasn't much loss of revenue because, in London you really can't get around London without using the tube or the buses. So within 2 weeks, numbers were back to normal. So there wasn't much loss there. There was some loss of tourism. Right? But what was found, though, is while London lost, Manchester gained, Edinburgh gained, Glasgow gained. So people still decided to go to the UK, but they went to other locations in the UK. So when we pick $5 billion, that's a very generous estimate. We're really saying that the loss of life and direct economic losses were probably $1 billion, and then we increase it fivefold to include, we have public reaction to fear and so on. So we tend to pick a very high number. If I was to think what I felt the actual number was, it'd probably be $1 or $2 billion, right? Which would then, mean that you need to prevent many, many more attacks than what was shown here. So in most cases, we've tried to be overly generous. We're trying to show that these measures are cost effective. We're not trying to bias our calculations. We're biasing the other way, and even when we bias it so much, it's still very hard to show that they're cost effective.
Okay, on your first question, but let me just add on that. I mean, there's sort of three costs. We include two of them. One is the direct costs of the attack, so that's loss of life, which is more or less $7 million or something per lost life, and that's a standard thing. You can see where that comes from. The second would be also a direct cost, would be property damage. And that's the direct cost, the loss of life, property damage. Then there's secondary costs, which we do include, which would be reduced tourism or economic downturn. The thing we don't include, which could be included, would be the reaction costs, which would be like going to war in Iraq. If you think 9/11 caused the United States to go into the war in Iraq, then the cost of that terrorist act was fantastically high. So when we look at individual attacks, it's good to break it down that way. For example, in the case of 9/11, the direct costs were maybe $60 billion, including life and the property damage. And the ancillary costs, secondary costs, which is stock market issues, people not touring, people not flying, and so forth, is probably greater than that. And there's about 5 studies that try to figure out what the costs of 9/11 were. And a somewhat high estimate is $200 billion, which is what we use. So the direct costs were less than half of the total costs of those. Other attacks, for example, the shootings at Fort Hood killed 14 people. And it's hard to see that there's any cost beyond that. People didn't stop going to Texas or anything like that, so it would just be the direct cost of the people's lives and presumably some property damage. In the case of Boston, that was sort of the issue was basically the policing costs, because there was the direct costs, which are fairly low, and there's only 3 people died, and there's injuries you can try to put into that if you want. But there was a lot of cost in trying to get the guys who did it, and that's why it's fairly high. And closing down the city for a couple of days is expensive, so that was included. In terms of your first question about what's at action here, it's basically democracy in action. People are, I think it's mostly bottom up. They're not being manipulated by the media, Fox News, or anybody else. They're not being manipulated by the politicians. The politicians are responding to them. Let me give you a very pertinent, exact example of that. The Charlie Savage book called Power Wars, it just came out 2-3 months ago, early in the year, has something at the very beginning which is really interesting. He looks at the early years of the Obama administration, the second administration, no, the first administration. The first administration, from 2008 to 2009, they didn't have a high priority on terrorism. Then in December, what happened was the underwear bomber took place, and that had a fairly big impact. A couple of weeks later, there was a by-election in Massachusetts to fill the seat of the recently deceased Ted Kennedy, and a Republican won. The Republicans immediately streamed to Massachusetts to say, what did you do? How did you win? It was the bluest seat in the bluest state, and the Republicans won it. And they said, well, it was terrorism that did it. People were afraid of terrorism, and because of the underwear bomber. And so the Republicans then, Mitch McConnell specifically at a meeting in Washington, said, if it will sell in Massachusetts, it'll sell all out throughout the country. So it's not the politicians manipulating the people who are manipulating the politicians. They're playing to it. And so when you've got these fears, which are frequently irrational, the politicians basically follow that. It tends to be much more, and reversing it, which is your part of your question too, is extremely difficult. What's happened now, the Obama administration has been more temperate on this issue, just generally, though the late Bush administration was too. And Obama, a year ago, in January 2015, a bit more than a year, decided to say that ISIS did not present an existential threat to the United States. Now, from my standpoint, that's so banal and obvious that it's strange that anybody would have to say it. But this is the first time a public figure really had publicly and forcefully said that the terrorism does not present an existential threat to the United States. It doesn't mean it's not a problem, obviously, but the idea that the whole United States could United States could go out of existence because of terrorism, which is frequently said with the Al Qaeda threat, it's just a patent nonsense, it seems to me. And so the president did say that, and he got away with it. It didn't hurt him politically, but it didn't seem to help him either. So if Obama can't lower the perceived threat level, sure as hell Mark and I can't. Though we're going to keep trying, I have to say.
I think we have 5 more minutes. Do you want to ask a question, Jim? Or we will have, we can have an informal discussion with our guests. I just want to remind you that we have books for sale for a very good rate.
Bargain rate.
A bargain rate.
$21, $30 book.
That's right. And also to remind you that the next seminar will be in another location. Knowing about cognitive burdens, I will not tell you where it is. You'll just accept it or expect it in your emails, but it will be in with Scott Atron in another location. No? Scott Shane, sorry. I'm mixing my Scots. All right, so thank you so much.